Hi, my name is Devin Griffiths. I'm a professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California, and I want to talk to you today about Barnaby Rudge. So I'm going to be your reading buddy for chapters 13 to 23, and these are fascinating chapters. A lot happens, but I think there are two main things that happen over the course of these chapters that you should pay attention to. The first thing happens right at the beginning, and it has to do with the romance between Ned Chester and Emma Haredale. And specifically, Ned gets sort of ambushed by Emma's father when he tries to visit her, and he tells Ned that you're not an appropriate match for my daughter, you need to move on. And immediately after that, Ned realizes that his father, Mr. Chester, has recently had an audience with Mr. Haredale. They've talked. And so he goes to his father to try to figure out what he can do. And so there's this fascinating discussion in chapter 15 in which Ned sits down with his father and he says, look, I've spent my entire life preparing to be a gentleman, and I've realized I don't have anything to offer Miss Haredale. And his father says, yes, you do. You've got a title. Ned's sort of shock at the fact that his father is proposing this arrangement, this idea that he would be a fortune hunter on page 133, cuts right to the core of what the romance plot is about in many 19th century novels. I want you to think about love relationships in the 19th century novel as dominated by this sort of triangle. There's love and romance at sort of one corner of the triangle. There's sort of status and class position at another corner of the triangle. And there's money at another corner of the triangle. And the novel's always trying to figure out how to balance the relationship between these elements. Now, it's important to realize that for Mr. Chester, love doesn't feature at all. The only thing is, how do you balance status and wealth? And as a matter of fact, this sort of 19th century novel is filled with people who understand the basic equation to be an attempt to match social status in one potential candidate to the wealth offered by another candidate for a relationship. And the novel is always trying to figure out, how do you restore love to the equation, right? How do people figure out how to marry for love and find a real romance? And this is a really tricky thing, because if everybody knows at the end of the day, partly this is about setting up an adequate balance between wealth and status, if that's an important part of this triangle, then how can they tell that love is not fake, right? That they're not using love or romance as a way to convince the other potential mate that they're really after them for romance when they're only after them for their class position, their status, say, as a member of the gentry, or they're only after them for the money that they have, the wealth that they'll inherit. Dickens' solution to that in this novel, at least in the relationship between Ned and Emma, seems to be religion, right? Religion sets up this impossible divide, this distinction between them, and the idea is they fall in love despite their religion. That proves it's real love. In a Jane Austen novel, you'll see the same thing, except it's often that the two characters that are going to end up being together don't see each other as potential matches for some reason. Either they've got a deep initial antipathy, they don't like each other, or maybe they're relatives and they just don't think of each other that way. Dickens is clearly thinking about that sort of triangulation that the novel has about romance. But the other big thing I think you should pay attention to really is the way in which these chapters worry the basic question of the novel. So when I visited Miss Barrios' class and I talked to all of you, I was talking a little bit about the importance of the mob, of the crowd, to the 19th century imagination, and this anxiety that whenever you have a riot or a mob of people together, that ultimately that social disturbance will lead to a revolution. And the reason they're always worried about this is because of the French Revolution and the way in which that mass popular action had led to the destruction of the monarchy, the execution of the king and queen, and a total destabilization of the French state that lasted for decades. So, in this novel, as I said, Dickens is consistently worried about three things, I think, when he looks at a mob. On the one hand, you have a collapse of the law. The law doesn't seem to hold. Rules of civil law and criminal law don't seem to apply. And therefore, the question is, where does justice exist within a mob? Two, he's worried about a collapse of class and gender distinctions. the way in which what the sort of social codes that would usually allow the gentry of the aristocracy to have priority over somebody who's poor in a mob seems to fall away. But this is also true in terms of the participation of women in mass action and collective violence, something that Dickens worries about even more in his revolutionary novel about the French Revolution, A Tale of Two Cities. But third, and perhaps most important, there's the loss of individuality. Mobs are defined by the fact that the people who enter into them lose their individual identity, their individual character. And we spent some time looking at specific passages that show that happening. But the thing that we didn't talk about, and the thing I want to talk about today is, every time these sort of collective social scenes are staged, Dickens starts to worry about the question of control. Who is it who can control a mob? Is a mob mindless, or is there somebody inside of it directing it? And contrarily, is it possible for somebody to intervene from the outside? Is it possible for an individual to confront a mob and change its course? This is a consistent concern in this novel. It happens at multiple points. The first part I want to point you to is in the scene where we have this sort of mysterious stranger circulating in London, right? And you remember, this is the stranger who assaulted Ned on the highway, right? This is a stranger who spent some time at the Maypole. And so now this person seems to be sort of wandering the streets at night. And at one point, he's accosted by a group of men. This is on page 133, I think, 135. Sorry, 142. I apologize. 142. Okay. So the stranger is asked by them, who are you? What are you doing here? There are tales among us that you have sold yourself to the devil, I know not what. And notice that there's an individual speaking, but they're not identified by names. They're not really differentiated from the other people. The stranger says, well, we all have we not? In other words, he's saying, I'm part of you, right? If we were fewer in numbers, perhaps we would give better wages. So he's sort of showing them, I see things the same way you do. I'm part of your group. Don't single me out. And then the fellow responds, it goes rather hard with you indeed. So the fellow, as the stranger discloses haggard and washed face and torn clothes, but what of that? Be merry, master, a stave of a roaring song now. And basically, the scene sort of devolves. And what you see is there's this growing threat that this group is going to accost him and do something to him because they don't see him as one of them. They're afraid of him. But they're also sort of uncertain. Nobody seems to be exactly in charge. And you see that the stranger manages to hold them off by simply threatening them. There's a sense in which his individual action is able to transcend and sort of cow them and prevent them from attacking him. And so that kind of scene, just keep in your mind, is the nucleus of a scene we're going to see again and again in this novel. But the other big example of this, I think, that I want you to notice is the conversation between Sir Chester and Hugh, but at the very end in chapter 23. Basically, Chester, if you remember, has asked Hugh to come back to him because he left his riding whip just to give him an excuse to come visit him. And when Hugh shows up, he sort of takes what we would consider liberties. He doesn't seem to be as deferential to Chester as you'd expect, right? This is sort of foregrounded in that illustration on page 197, the fact that they're sort of placed both on a chair, they're confronting each other, and there's differences, but there's also commonalities between them. What's interesting about this scene is Chester manages, without using strength, without even exactly using any overt pulling of rank, to sort of totally cow Hugh. And there's this passage on page 199 where at the end of it, simply by subtly threatening him while smiling, we get this description, middle of the page. The ascendancy which it was the purpose of the man of the world to establish over this savage instrument was gained from that time. Hugh's submission was complete. He dreaded him beyond description and felt that accident and artifice had spun a web about him, which at a touch from such a master hand as his would bind him to the gallows. What's interesting, I think, in such scenes as this, is even though what we're really talking about is a strong class distinction and sort of the prerogative of wealth and power over the powerless, it's rendered as superior craft and intelligence. And not just that, the language that's used, this idea that Chester spins a web, that he turns Hugh into an instrument or into a fly, sort of naturalizes this distinction as one between a fully invested person and an object, or one between a predator and his prey. And so to sort of summarize the point, this is in some way Dickens's attempt to figure out, like, how is it that people can intervene and change the mob if there's a lack of individuality? And one of the solutions he clearly seems to be working on, how do you assert control in these environments, is that you have to fall back on sort of naturalized forms of power. You have to sort of exert yourself in such a way that it's perceived as innately right in some sense. I hope that makes a little bit of sense, but just look at these scenes of confrontation between groups and individuals, and then keep watching the way that Dickens sort of balances this equation between wealth, status, and love in the various courtship plots of the novel, these various romances that you see going on. Anyway, thanks for listening to me. It's been fun talking, and I'll see you hopefully this summer. Take care. Bye.